But since this is a methane event, I should probably tell you that my family's from Yuan country, yada yada, and they run about 120 Angus beef cows down there. And I fully understand that this is a challenging topic for many Australians because every time there's a story in the newspaper about methane, my mum usually gives me a call and says, "What the hell are you doing now?" But it also gives me a bit of faith because growing up down there, I do remember my grandfather thinking it was a bit strange when I said I might try vegetarianism for a while. But a few years later, he turned to me and he said, "Look, Chris, what you're doing is pretty good. If you ever need money, let us know. I'll sell a cow." So this is a challenging issue for Australia and for many Australians, but what we're doing here is we want to highlight the opportunities, and particularly the opportunities over the next few years where I believe, and many people here believe, Australia could take a leading role on creating the accelerated pathway to action at COP31. The Brazilians are already on board. There's an oil and gas focus here. There are opportunities to take forward, and we've got 4 of the leading experts in the world. It will be 5 by the end of the talk to talk about methane opportunities in different sectors and from different parts of the world. We have experts here from China, from the US, from Chile. We'll have 1 from the Netherlands and from Australia as well. So what we've tried to do here is bring forward a global panel. You'll be able to ask some questions towards the end and have any thoughts in your mind cleared up. They'll also be around, and I believe there'll be some opportunities where you might see them in Australia next year as well, and we might reveal that later on. But for now, we're going to start with some presentations to give you the ground truths. And our first presenter is going to be Chen Mian, the Senior Program Director at the Institute for Global Decarbonization Progress. And if you've forgotten all of that, just think about one of the most important NGOs in China talking about methane and coal mines and all of the elements around China's methane challenge. And Chen Mian's going to give us a bit of an intro into how that challenge can be transformed into an opportunity. Welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's truly been an honor to be here and to share some of our observations about China's methane emissions reduction. So should I start here? Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, before I start, I would like to have a quick introduction about our organization. IGDP stands for Institute for Global Decarbonization Progress. So we are a China-based nonprofit climate think tank and working with both international and local partners to advance the development and implementation of climate solutions in China. So one of our key areas is about Beyond Carbon, which focuses on the non-CO2 emissions reduction that including methane. So first, I'd like to start with a basic picture about China's methane emissions. So if we look at the map, actually China in 2018. 10% of China's actually 10% of China's greenhouse gases emissions from methane. Of course, here we use GWP is 21 instead of 28. So if we use like GWP 28, the share of the methane emissions might be become like larger in China's greenhouse gases emissions. So if we look at China's emission methods breakdown by different sectors, we can see actually most of China's methane emissions are from energy sector, especially about coal mining, especially from coal mining, and there was just a few from oil and gas. So compared with other regions, for example, like the US and the EU, China's energy methane, actually most of China's energy methane are from coal mining instead of oil and gas. Because if we look at the US and Europe countries, a lot actually are from the oil and gas. So which means the methane mitigation challenge in China might also be a little bit different compared with other countries. So here we can take a look at China's and coal mine methods actually by different activities. So 80% of China's coal mining methane actually from underground activities, and the remaining coal mine methods actually are from like open pit and abandoned coal mining and also post coal activities. So in this, a lot of like coal mine methods in the underground activities, more than 80% actually from the ventilation air method, which is kind of like the method that is from to avoid underground activities or accidents. So they actually pump a lot of air into the ventilation system, trying to reduce the methane emission, the level of methane concentrations. So that actually makes the VAM's methane concentration is pretty low. Usually it's smaller than 0.2%. And because it's very low, so which makes it very hard to utilize, to capture and utilize. So that is a big challenge because we know actually for the coal mine methane with different methane concentrations that requires different technology and also policy response. So here are some like policy updates about China's methane emissions reduction. So one of the most important policy is China's National Methane Action Plan, which is released last year. And in this National Methane Action Plan, there is a specific task is about in the energy sectors. So we can see some details about that. So that is increasing coal mine methanes capture and utilizations. They have like specific numbers there. And following the release of China's National Methane Action Plan, we saw there are some subnational regions also developed their local methane action plans. For example, we have like Shanxi Province, Ningxia, and Tianjin, Guangdong. So these actually provinces already developed their local methane action plans that actually reflect, that can align with their local priorities. For example, in the Ningxia, they probably focus on the livestock. And in the Guangdong province, they have a lot of methane from waste sector. And in their local action plan, they probably pay more attention about waste sector. And so here is an example about Shanxi province. Because Shanxi province actually is the largest, coal production province and also with the largest coal mine methane emissions. So Shanxi also released its local methane action plans. So in their methane plans, we can see they actually set quantitative targets to utilize coal mine methane and also have some pilot projects to management and utilization abandoned coal mine methane. That is also a very important topic in China. So in addition to these policy updates in methane reduction in general, we also have some like policy updates about coal mine methane. So the first important one is about emission standards. So for the old emission standards, they only regulate methane coal mine methanes with methane concentration that is larger than 30%, which means for all this coal mine methane with methane concentration less than 30%, they are allowed to discharge without any consequence. That is a big issue in China. But currently, they actually put more like stringent limits on the emission standards. And then they put limits at 8%, which means for all coal mine methane with methane concentration larger than 8%, they need to be regulated. We're not going to be emit without any consequence. So that is one very important policy update in the coal mine methane. And another very important one is about the CCER methodology. So which is a methodology that actually is going to generate carbon credits from coal mine methane with very low methane concentration and also the VAM projects. So with this kind of like methodologies, for all these kind of projects that is going to focus on the low methane concentration coal mine methane and also VAM, they are able to generate some carbon credits by selling this to the companies that is regulated by China's carbon market. Okay, so but even with these policy updates, we still have some like challenges. One of the key challenges China still facing is about the emission data. So as mentioned in China's National Action Plan, so China is going to still need to working on methane emission data's MRV. And another challenge is about the technology, especially for the VAM and also for other kind of low methane concentration coal mine methane. So if you want to reduce this kind of like methanes, that is going to take a lot of like money without government subsidies. So it will be really hard. So the last challenge actually is from the abandoned coal mine methane, because as China is trying to accelerate its energy transition, we're going to see more abandoned coal mine, and especially the how to deal with abandoned coal mine methane will become like a key issue in China. So here are some of my observations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chen Mian. And two of my favorite things about the opportunity of collaboration on methane with China is Australia's got about 30 million cows. And we've got this great innovation in red seaweed to try and reduce methane there. China's got 100 million cows. What a great market to try and export that product in the future if we're able to make that product cost effective. And actually the first ever VAM project in China was a collaboration between the CSIRO and Chinese partners in 2011. So there's already a 15-year collaboration on coal mine methane there that we could really tap into going forward. Our next speaker is Derek Walker, who is the Vice President of the Global Energy Transition within the EDF. And I actually met him at the bakery, got some great taste in local breads if you are interested in what you can get at the supermarket these days. Derek, welcome to the mic.
Thanks, Chris. I'd like to think that's only one of my qualifications to be standing here before you today. EDF is a global organization that really focuses on the boldest game-changing climate solutions that we can work on, and we're an organization that is really rooted in using data and analytics through economic, scientific, and policy and legal disciplines to make policy go faster, to make markets grow faster, and to make emissions reductions happen at scale. And so that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. One of our top goals at EDF is to reduce methane from the energy sector. Methane reduction, as many of you likely already know, is one of the fastest, cheapest, and most effective ways to tackle the climate crisis. And by tackling emissions reductions from methane and by creating a database case, you can make the policy case for further change, and we can hold actors accountable for doing the right thing. There you have EDF's methane satellite. EDF's methane satellite, which some of you may have heard of. We built this over the last 6-7 years. It was launched in March of 2024. And the purpose of it is to create fast, accurate, near real-time emissions measurements to promote direct emissions reductions of methane globally, primarily from the energy sector. The data from MethaneSat, which is going to be fully coming out in early 2025, is free and available on an online portal. And what's more, if you're an academic, researcher, or a nonprofit organization, you have free access to the methane satellite data through Google Earth Engine. One unique thing about our satellite is that it's able to measure methane along multiple scales. One is that it creates a big picture view of small and dispersed sources. It also can capture methane emissions from major super emitters, and it can also characterize methane emissions across countries, regions, and basins. So several different scales. It's also highly accurate and precise in a way that other satellites of this kind have not been in the past. I should have showed you, I'm not used to using PowerPoint. That's a picture of the satellite. This is a little bit of a 3D drawing or image of how some of the methane emissions detection works. So our initial focus in an Australian context is on the Bowen Basin in Queensland. And the timing is perfect, given that there are these concurrent commitments in Australia to really ramp up the capacity for methane MRV. I think that same thing could be said about other countries. across the Asia Pacific, there's been a dramatic increase in looking at how methane leakage is occurring across the LNG supply chain. And I think that the methane satellite and the data from the methane satellite will be very salient there as importers think about how they can set intensity targets, and as producers and suppliers can work together to really drive methane emissions out of the supply chain. I want to give you a specific, because the methane satellite was just launched, data is going to be available next year. I want to give you a specific example from the US of where methane measurement data has been already used to great effect. This is a project called the Permian Map, or the Methane Analysis Project. It was launched 5 years ago. And the purpose is to provide real-time methane measurement in the Permian Basin, which for those of you who know the US geography, it straddles both Texas and New Mexico. This is the largest oil-producing basin in the world. And we used various methods to collect and report out on data which was made available to the public so that it could be the basis for advocacy. I'll tell you about three major insights that we had in doing this project, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we did with the data and what the outcomes were. So the first insight is that midstream operations, like transportation and storage, are a huge source of fugitive methane, as well as flares that are not working correctly. We found that 1 in 10 flares are malfunctioning in that region, and that is a huge source of fugitive methane emissions. The second key insight is that there are a large number of super emitters. Now, every jurisdiction defines super emitters differently, but these are large point sources. And significantly for the Permian Basin, since it's the largest oil producing region in the world, a lot of these super emitters do not report emissions. So this mapping project was one of the first opportunities to characterize the size of those emissions reductions. The third key insight, which I alluded to earlier, is that just because you're a larger or smaller producer doesn't mean there's a correlation between the emissions problem that you're causing. We found a lot of small and disparate sources across the Permian that were leading to high methane concentrations and could be high polluters even though they were small producers. So what did we do with all this data? Well, we unleashed it on policymakers and made it available to the general public and our fellow allies and advocates. One of the things that happened is the state of New Mexico, which is one of the 2 states where the Permian is under, set the strongest methane pollution standards of any state in the US. That was largely inspired by and informed by the data that came out of this Permian Map project. Secondly, the state of Texas increased their transparency requirements on flaring. So producers had to provide more granular and real-time data on flaring, and especially pinpointing where some of those malfunctions were occurring. The US EPA developed oil and gas standards that homed in on these smaller oil and gas producers where the sites are especially leak prone, making sure that there were fewer gaps in the regulatory architecture. And then companies were able to leverage the data to explain why they were interested in getting involved in and committing to voluntary initiatives. So we saw just a number of different applications of the Permian Map project leading to policy change, leading to corporate commitments, and really driving increased public awareness and political saliency of the methane issue, which I think continues to this day. And all of this really paved the way to being able to establish this groundbreaking global effort, which became Methane Sat. So I'll look forward to further discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for having me here today and for being here to listen to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Derek. And what an amazing opportunity here at COP where you can meet someone like Derek in the bakery and then realize that the person you just bumped into happens to be one of the smartest people in the world at this particular topic. We're now going to go back to Australia, and our next speaker is Kiran Narula, the senior strategist at the Sunrise Project, and has been thinking about this a lot and is going to frame some of his thoughts for all of you now. Welcome, Kiran.
Thanks, Chris, and hey, everyone. Yeah, I'm Kiran. I'm from Tassie originally, but now on Gadigal land in Sydney in sunny Bondi. And thanks all for coming. It's really awesome and super exciting to have our international colleagues here. I also wear a hat as an advisory board member to the UN International Methane Emissions Observatory, and looking forward to having Roland here later. But I'm going to talk a bit from a Sunrise perspective today. So just a teeny bit about the Sunrise Project. We're an international climate funder. We provide research, strategy and coordination across about 20 countries. Huge Australia focus where the mission is accelerating the phase out of fossil fuels and encouraging a just transition to renewables and renewable manufacturing very quickly. And globally, my colleagues focus on accelerating the greening of the global financial system. I want to talk a bit about why methane matters. I'll click the rest of these things in a second. But, you know, we've been on this road sort of careening on the highway of sort of global warming and global heating. And at this moment, to 2030, we really need to hit the brakes. And methane is literally that brake. It's not just taking your foot off the accelerator. It will cut the rate of heating. So to give you some figures, we're talking 0.2 degrees of avoided warming by 2040 if we can make good on the global methane pledge level of ambition to 2030, and 0.6 degrees this century, which if you're a Pacific island state looking at that, or another climate affected community, Australia is one of the most climate affected places in the world, that's incredibly important while we do the rest of the global energy transition. And I'll come back to that with some more sexy stats. But look, methane's responsible for about a third of warming. And let's talk a little bit more about where Australia sits in that mix. So we're a global methane pledge signatory along with, you know, over 159 other countries. Sorry, I'm just going to go back here. Yeah, and look, in terms of where we're sitting at the moment, I'm going to talk through some of the sub areas, but our next steps are really clear. We're setting our next NDC, and there's a crystal clear opportunity on the advice of the UN, on the advice of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, that is the Secretariat to the Global Methane Hub, to set methane targets in our next NDC. That was part of the agreement in the Global Stocktake last year at COP, and to make plans to achieve those emissions cuts and work on our monitoring, reporting and verification to make sure that we know what we're doing and we can share that with the rest of the world. So really, really clear point there. In terms of our opportunity to drive mitigation, if we sort of add up what that would lead to in Australia over the next 20 years in terms of avoided heating, the amount of emissions is actually greater than the carbon dioxide over that time. So, you know, we're up in the 400 to 500 million tonnes of avoided warming in CO2e over that next 20 years. So pretty significant opportunity to drive mitigation. I want to talk a bit about energy. You know, Australia, third biggest fossil fuel exporter in the world, biggest metallurgical coal exporter. And there's this, you know, really clear signal from the government. You know, Chris Bowen last COP talking about, we know where things are going, where we're looking at the phase out of energy across our energy systems with our regional partners in Korea, Japan, Australia's key export markets. And in that context, methane is a really helpful organising principle to start thinking about, okay, what do we do here? What's the actual way to address the methane emissions in Australia from the energy sector while we're on that track? This is Glencore's HVO mine in New South Wales. It's in the Hunter Valley, a few hours north of Sydney. And this just pulled its application to extend. Would have led to another 1 billion tonnes of warming across all, emissions across all scopes. And this is a sign that the consideration of methane is starting to work. You know, decision makers in New South Wales are looking at the state's emissions reduction pathway. They're talking to the company about its plans and how much it's mitigating, and they're saying, look, you know, how's this going to stack up? Where's it going to come together? And I think there's a real opportunity for Australia to do that and look at sharpening the safeguard and other key federal policy mechanisms to really start putting pressure on and finding the really low-hanging fruit. And I'll give you a stat on that. So Australia could reduce its coal mine methane emissions by half for a loss of production of about 8 or 9% of coal production. So you've got this crazy asymmetry where some of the biggest emitters, like Glencore's Hell Creek, the rate of some of these super emitting events that Derek was talking about that have been observed, we're in the 14 million cars on or off the road. Like, that's the rate of heating, emissions that are coming out of some of these events. And that's a mine that's looking to expand. So, you know, there's some pretty simple measures that we can do here to start sharpening our thinking around methane and factoring that in. Been a bit of a conversation about MRV. There's been fantastic progress in Australia recently. I think the literacy among federal and state policymakers is really coming along. So there's been a federal review into national greenhouse and energy reporting specifically focused on methane. We kind of got about halfway there to, I would say, like world's best practice, but the job's sort of not done. But in that process, and welcome Roland, I was just going to say, in that process of focusing on federal monitoring, reporting and verification, 60% of Australia's covered gas companies signed up to the OGMP 2.0, which is the sort of gold standard in terms of voluntary commitments. So there's this really clear opportunity for the Australian government to say, all right, let's get to the end. Let's have coal and gas companies actually measuring their emissions at the site level and the source on equipment, and then really building the national verification using this exciting satellite technology, aerial flyovers. We've got state-level regulators like the New South Wales EPA already starting to do its own aerial flyovers. So this stuff's there, it's coming together. There's a new panel led by Australia's chief scientist from the CSIRO, Kathy Foley, that's going to look at how to bring this all together, and the government's funded a study into open-cut measurement technology. So we're really getting somewhere, and when we talk about a 70% underreporting gap globally in energy, you start seeing how Australia really nailing its bit and being a part of these global research communities could be really impactful at nailing that data bit, and then starting to get serious about how we're talking about methane emissions reductions and the sort of policy measures that we could apply. And we are a $1.5 million across 2 years contributor to IMEO, so there's good federal government alignment there. I'm going to say a few quick words about ag and some of the international opportunities and then wrap. Chris has mentioned this exciting Asparagopsis seaweed thing. It is an opportunity. I'll just say, to add to that, over half of India's methane is from cattle, and they've they haven't signed up to the Global Methane Pledge yet, and ag is a big sticking point. So, what can we do to help them along? What can we do to help and collaborate with them while they're still mining a lot of coal and expanding that coal production at the moment? How can Australia's diplomacy through the Quad be part of that solutions bit? Just a couple of things on ag. So, I'm reading a lot of sci-fi at the moment. I'm a big Red Rising fan. Massive shout out for that book. And one of the quotes from one of the characters is, "The bill comes at the end," which is this kind of, mythic space soap opera thing. But, the bill that we're getting for agriculture, it's already started coming. So, 12% decrease in soy production already. And these are 10 years old figures, actually. This is 2010 to 2012. 7% in terms of wheat, 4.5% for rice. And, basically there's this ozone precursor thing that methane's involved in. And there's a huge co-benefit for food security there. I'll give you one on health. The total avoided deaths is estimated at 4.5 million, on these 2-degree aligned methane emissions reduction paths. The cost of that in terms of lives, if you want to do those social cost calculations, comes out at $700 billion US, which is the cost of the estimated energy transition. So, we've got a co-benefit of health on this without even then getting into the economic opportunities in Australia's role, whether it's direct exports or through that capability. So pretty impressive stuff. Look, I'll just quickly wrap on this. I think there's this whole conversation with a lot of our Asian trading partners in particular about, look, what's the decarbonisation pathway here, both for power and energy? And there's a really interesting sort of trade flow through point, which is going to come with the introduction of the EU CBAM. I mean, Derek spoke a little bit to importer-exporter standards. There's going to be a price signal, but there could also be emissions intensity signals. And that super emitting coal mine I talked about before, Hell Creek, it all exports to Europe. So, you know, we've got a mine that's 30 to 35 times more emissions intensive, exporting into a market that's about to start costing those emissions. So there's a real trade imperative here for Australia to really take that seriously, and then to think about, okay, on the path to lower emissions steel, what's the role of those emissions intensity cuts, and how can that be part of the conversation then when we're talking about the investment in green metals, green steel, Australia's role to genuinely like bring that conversation together and look at what the investment and standards in the meantime are to kind of get there. Look, I'll leave it there. The final thing I'd just sort of say, there's a 22% reduction in projected sea level rise from acting quickly on methane. Like, this isn't academic, and we're really keen to kind of take the conversation forward, so please come say hi after, but looking forward to continuing the conversation. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Hakiran. And we're now going to turn to our final presenter today before we get into a bit of a Q&A session. And we're going to go from China, from the US, from Australia now to a bit of a global picture. And we're going to pass on to Marcelo Mena, who is not only the CEO of the Global Methane Hub, but is the former environment minister in Chile, which has not only made some of the most drastic changes in transforming their energy sector over the last couple of years, but also has pretty good wine. And I wonder if that wine is almost as good as ours. So Marcelo, welcome to the stage.
Thank you. I frankly think New Zealand wine is among the best. So no, I couldn't go back to Chile if I say that. So thanks for the invitation. I don't have slides, and if I had slides, I'd be thinking, why didn't I include the new data that's available today? The MethaneSat data has been revealed recently, and it's really great. I think they're over-delivering, under-promising and over-delivering, which is really amazing. Also, Tanager 1 carbon mapper information is also available, and I encourage you to visit it, even with your cell phone, because it's open for cell phone access, which I've been spending most of the morning on. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is if we want to keep 1.5 alive, this is the way to do it. Methane and non-CO2 pollutants could help reduce 0.5 degrees by 2050. And by doing so, we could actually reduce almost half of the air pollution globally, half of the mortality associated to this, almost 4 million people a year. So that's not a bad thing to aspire to. As you know, this methane has contributed to nearly half of the warming that we've experienced to date. If you add the non-CO2 pollutants, it's half the warming, the other half that we're not really talking about overall. So I do think that last year's methane summit between the US and China was really important. The question is, what's the next step? Article 28F says that countries should have methane and non-CO2 mitigation strategies, but we need to be a little bit more specific of what that means. And the next step, the natural step, is of course to include that in the nationally determined contributions. It's encouraging to hear yesterday, for example, Brazil, Mexico, and 10 other Latin American countries saying we'll include these in the context of landfill emissions. And this is something that's very important because these are major sources that allow you to tackle multiple environmental justice issues at once. Going back to where this is coming from, half of it, 40% of it from oil and gas and coal. And when you're talking about coal emissions, it's mostly China, metallurgical coal, Australian, Indian coal, where this is mostly concentrated on. And it's actually in very limited regions. So instead of it being a problem of millions of wells, it's hundreds of mines, and it's well within something we could manage. And there's multiple economic incentives, and it's been really great to follow EDF China and visit some of those mines and seeing what you just described of the extraction of the methane, using it for power. Before what used to happen is you would extract air, right, that you want to vent, clean out with the methane, used to vent it and use a coal-fired generator to power that. Now, with really great innovation from China, you have lower concentration streams using the methane itself to power and extract and do it much cleaner than it used to be with coal. So I do think that there's really a lot of merit. The other half is food production and food waste, and there's a lot of things that we could do. Australia recently hosted the Global Food Banking Network conference, in which we're looking at how food banking could be a really great opportunity to reduce that organic waste from reaching the landfill and actually contributing to multiple other social benefits, including improving food security. So what we also want to do with the Carbon Mapper and MethaneStat collaboration is something that we call tip and cue. Think of MethaneStat covering broad swaths of land, covering and measuring all sources like a binocular, and then if you see something salient, you could cue it up and go zoom into this and expand with like a microscope and being able to see a point source emission and actually be able to take some action. Of course, there's things that are the cornerstone of what we think methane mitigation will be in the energy sector, which is IMEO, which is the European import standards, and the whole infrastructure that will be built around this. And I'm excited about this because it's a new dimension of environmental movement. It has to do not only with regulations and advocacy, it's got to do with the power of markets and trade. And in this case, it doesn't have to be a consensus, which keeps us from making a lot of progress sometimes. It's the consensus of wanting to do business together. And this will keep pressure going on. And so the European Union has been very clear. Our methane import standard rules are not going anywhere. And so therefore, if the US wants to expand production and export to the US, to the EU, it will be under those regulations. And of course, US companies think that this is much better for them to have a framework which they could look into, which is the US methane standards. And they've called on the Trump administration to maintain these rules, because it's a way to organize themselves. Otherwise, they're just going to have to go about it, each one their own way, and that will be more problematic for them. This approach is something that other different groups are considering. Japan yesterday presented their CLEAN initiative to look at LNG requirements and on emissions, what they describe as the first project-based emissions measurements and estimation. And so that means that, for example, LNG from Australia that wants to access that market will need to meet those requirements. And of course, the other big purchaser of LNG globally, Korea, is also looking to similar approaches. If you add that purchasing power of Korea, EU, Japan, and UK, who recently said that they would be looking into this, this is over 70% of the LNG market. And so it's a really great way to put pressure. And I've seen the pressure response. For example, Argentina, who, left COP, but the oil and gas exporters, they have full intention of meeting the European import standards because they know and describe as climate as a trade and market issue. I think that's fascinating as a new dimension. And of course, Kazakhstan has shown their own interest in tackling emissions, as so has Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. So I think this is a new dimension and that we should really consider overall. If all these commitments materialize, around 50% of oil and gas emissions can be reduced according to the IEA recent report. The other thing I just wanted to finalize on, well, landfill emissions, of course, are very important, and we have a really great opportunity. And the Methane Hub has helped support many NGOs in what we call the waste map, in which we literally have hundreds of cities of where around 500 million people live, in which we link the city, the NGO, and the satellite information to look at the emissions, look at the solutions, and actually fund those solutions. And we've teamed up with MDBs, with different programs to leverage almost $10 billion in funding from the MDBs. including IDB, including AFAD, among others. Finally, I wanted to talk about the things that you had just said. When we talk about methane, a lot of people that have a lot of cows get nervous. And I want to say half of what we fund is actually going to tackling methane emissions from livestock. So, and we want to have more solutions. So Australia has been a great innovator with groups like Ruminate, which has a permit to operate already in places like Brazil. And it will be really fascinating to see what the Brazilian Beef Association will bring to COP because they're interested in bringing solutions. But there's also research and development that we need to do to expand. And this last year, we've been able, along with the Bezos Earth Fund and Gates, deliver $60 million in research and development for livestock emission enteric fermentation research, including, for example, selecting better species that not only produce a lot more milk or meat, but actually reduce emissions. Vaccines, almost $50 million in vaccine research, because a lot of the solutions that we have at hand require the animal to eat that algae every day, every mouthful. And if we have a vaccine that will be able to be useful for extensive systems, just think about the large ranches in Australia, you know, we have different activities that we could help support. And also looking at the long-term benefits of those feed additives. Because the reality is, when you don't have the cow belching that methane, there's a potential 8% yield that we could seize on. And some initial research has shown that, for example, 3-NOP or the algae could actually increase the milk production in around 3 to 4%. So that won't only be a climate benefit, but also if we find it in line to a benefit to the farmer, it will actually be something that could pay for itself. So I just wanted to say that methane is the low-hanging fruit as we're thinking about different ambition that we need to bring to COP in the next NDC process. It's something that we could seize on. And I actually do think that with the leadership of China here present and with Australia, I do think that we could keep on the torch going and having methane mitigation be not only a little sideshow, but actually at the core of the negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. And you would have seen we have a new guest that has joined our panel. And we're going to jump now into the question and answer opportunity. And I've got a couple of questions to kick things off, but we certainly have time to get questions from the audience. You might have noticed they were a little bit rushed when they were presenting. That's because we wanted to have time for you all to ask questions of the panel. But just before we open it up, I wanted to throw out a question for everyone.
Chris, before you do open it up, I think Roland did have some comments as
Okay,
well.
Roland, do you want to start?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I will. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, mate.
No. Thank you. So thank you. So my name's Roland Coopers. I represent UNEP and in particular the International Methane Emissions Observatory. And I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we do. I mean, obviously, and I hope you've heard it a million times at this COP, you know, it isn't about a choice between CO2 and methane. We need to do both, right? But this is important because this isn't a get out of jail card, but it's a necessary part of global policy. So our particular mission is we focus really on methane, and we focus on methane data, but what we focus on is getting data to the level of agency at the granularity where the agency lies to fix the emissions. And this is, you know, may sound trite, but it's actually very important because it takes a human being on one day to take an action to mitigate. And that is at very different scales. And I think we don't think enough about where the agency lies. And that's at the core of our data reflection, is we want to have the data at the level where the agency lies, and only then do you have a chance to actually mitigate. So in our annual report that was released here yesterday, an eye on methane, it highlights what we do, and you know, I'm sure you have nothing better to do on the flight back than to read our annual report. But it's actually quite interesting, I think. We're very happy to welcome Australia as joining one of IMEO's supporting countries, and because IMEO is set up to be funded entirely by philanthropies. Also, the Global Methane Hub is one of our generous sponsors. But from the very beginning, if we're going to work with industry, we shouldn't take money from industry because it just messes up things. So that's how we're set up. So currently, let me just go quickly describe 4 of our programs and its relevance to this story. So our flagship program is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. It's called 2.0 because there was a 1.0 that was not very good. I was also part of negotiating that, but this is much better. It already, and for all sorts of contextual reasons, but it already assembles 140 oil and gas companies, and they commit to reaching what we call a level 5 standard of data. Not all data is on the same, right? You have lousy data, exact data, very good data, and so we've created a language to be able to distinguish between the types of data. But the big idea is to move the industry, particularly the oil and gas industry, but also others, from this business of estimations and using emission factors to actual measurement of valves and facility on the ground, because an engineer who needs to fix something needs to have data that's relevant to their piece of kit. And if it's just some sort of allocation or average, it's actually perfectly useless. So that's what we focus on, we cover 42% of global production and welcomed Woodside last year. In fact, OGMP covers 93% of Australians' oil and gas production, and we'd really like to get that to 100%. Now, I've got a couple of calls scheduled next week with the outstanding companies, whom you can guess who they are, but I think this would really cement it as a standard. It is by far the global standard for MRV, and as one of the designers, I'm happy to see that after many years it's holding up. But it's a very ambitious standard. You'll see in our report that not all companies, in fact, far from all companies, meet what we define as the gold standard. There is no shame in that because the gold standard is very hard to get to. And so if a company, for operational reasons, cannot get there in a particular year, there's always the next year. But we think it's important that it's not just some sort of tick-the-box standard, and it is extremely demanding. So we also look at other sectors, and particularly in Australia, this would be relevant. We also, reproducing the success of OGMP, we've created a clone called the Steel Methane Program, which deals with methane emissions in the steel value chain, met coal in particular. And, strangely enough, it's not very well known, and we keep repeating this like a broken record, but methane represents, on average, 1/3 of the climate footprint of steel. 1/3 of the climate footprint of steel, and it can be mitigated at less than 1% of the price of steel, using well-known methodologies. Again, this is a case where the tools are ready, but the met coal industry and the steel industry are a little bit pointing to each other and looking at each other and saying, who's really taking the initiative here? So this is something that needs to be catalyzed. BHP and Anglo American, particularly the Australian branches, were incredibly constructive in helping to design the standards and the targets, and we have technical guidance documents. The whole thing is done but needs to be launched. Another tool which we have is MARS. This is a methane alert response system. You've heard lots about satellites here and methane. It's actually not so simple, right? The satellite technology is brand new. The algorithms are complicated, the biases, the detection thresholds. So what we do is we have satellite scientists who take the information from 12 satellites, integrate them, and when there's a validated plume, we issue a notification on UN letterhead to the relevant government, and if it is an OGMP company, to the people we know in the company so they can fix it. We've issued 1,200 notifications so far over the past year. Regrettably, have had a 1% response rate, and that is really absolutely not where it should be. Now, you could say we've just started, but yeah. So there's some really, really fantastic success stories. For example, the poster child of emissions is the Hassi Messaoud field in the south of Algeria, which every PhD student looking at methane emissions and satellites looks at because it's so isolated and but it's also gone. So we've received a notice from Sonatrach 2 weeks ago that it's been eliminated. And so this was one of the Mars notifications, and there are other examples in the US and Nigeria and here in Azerbaijan as well. So not many, but it actually demonstrates that it can work. So the last topic I wanted to touch on, which is also relevant for Australia, is we have a very large program of methane science studies. And so we fund them, or refund them, because some of the money comes from others. But we manage them, certainly, and define them. They're always conducted by universities and independent researchers, and the results are published in peer-reviewed papers. So we're not in the business of saying, my report is better than yours, but we're in the business of putting it into the peer-reviewed literature because that's the standard we want to meet. So we've had extensive studies. As you know, a few years ago, Esron with Tropomi had seen in the Bowen Basin emissions that were 10 to 20 times the numbers that were reported to the Australian government under UNFCCC. We've redone those studies now using airplanes and satellites, etc. In last year in 2023. In order to validate them, inevitably you get slightly different results because it's a different period in time, but the emissions are not low. And it's this kind of empirical data at the asset level that's required in order to do mitigation, both in oil and gas, but also in coal. Now, we've done something similar in Poland. This was one of the first campaigns on metallurgical coal again. We focus on metallurgical coal because that is going to be with us for decades while we decarbonize steel. Thermal coal, I beg to defer. There are economic alternatives, and there's no really reason to have it, and it's a completely different economic system it works into. But so in Poland, we identified a number of mines, and we used every technology known to man, multiple satellites, airplanes, helicopters, drones, ground-based sensors, in order to validate how all these instruments, their biases, etc., can be harmonized and can be integrated. But the critical thing is that we had collaboration from the Polish mining companies that also gave us their own data from their mine sensors, and that made it a completely different study. That so far, unfortunately, I have to say, has been, notwithstanding lots of discussions with Glencore and BHP and Anglo, etc., and willingness and interest. We've not had access to their company data, and that is really the step that's required in order to do the science properly. I mean, this kind of external thing is interesting, but it's the asset owners need to take ownership of the effort. So the opportunities, and I will conclude with that, in Australia is, number one is getting to 100% on OGMP, which would be nice. And expanding these measurement studies. I mean, it's together with Australian universities, and clearly some of the mitigation technologies on VAM are starting to be deployed in Australia, and that's a good thing. So both building OGMP, as I said, by expanding the membership would be great, but more importantly, there's a real opportunity to champion this steel story. Right, because a lot of issues in methane and in climate have been around for decades, and we struggle like hell to solve them. This is actually a relatively unknown issue. Most steel companies don't realize that it's a third of their climate footprint, and that it actually varies between 0 and 60% depending on which mine you get your coal from. And this is doable for a relatively low cost, using known technology. We know where the mines are. It's a limited number of sources. This actually is doable, but it requires mobilizing the met coal industry, the steel industry, but also to some extent, the car companies of the future, Tesla, BYD, etc., who will increasingly object to having methane-intensive steel in their vehicles. So it's this whole ecosystem that needs to be weighed in upon. I will leave it there with this whirlwind of tour of our tools, but and just close with appreciation for the and it's not just money, right? Because we clearly need money, but it's the soft power and of our partners that matters. The clean, you mentioned the clean report before, is that you'll notice that for their asset level data, they use OGMP data in the report, because that is the only source of asset level data in the world today with a global international standard. And so it's that kind of partnership we have with Japan and Korea that we look forward to building out with Australia as well. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, Roland. Thank you so much. And sorry I even tried to cut in there. Roland's a theoretical physicist. If you want to ask anyone about satellites and inversion methodologies, he's the guy. And it's great talking about the steel industry. In Queensland, you've got 12 mines that make up 65% of Scope 1 emissions for the coal sector in the state. Between the LEAP $500 million and some PRF funding, we could knock those off, get mitigation, get the lowest metallurgical coal mine emissions, lowest emission metallurgical coal in the world, and continue to dominate that market while we still have it for the next 20 years or so. So what a great opportunity for Queensland and for Australia. We have a little bit of time left. So if you have an urgent question, throw your hands up. We'll get the mics to you. But that was very quick. Thank you very much, sir. I wanted to throw out very quickly, while we're getting the mic to you, Chen Mian, there are things happening in China across the methane space, but particularly in the coal space, that I think we would love to learn from in Australia. Is there an opportunity to get some collaboration going there, to get maybe policy and regulators starting to talk to each other across those spaces that you see?
Yes, absolutely. Because as we just discussed, China already have this national methane action plan, and following this national one, we also see a lot of like subnational regions also develop their own methane action plan. To implement these action plans, we should see more like regional collaborations between different subnational actors. So that'd be a very good opportunity if we can have some like subnational cooperation between China and Australia to share like this methane mitigation experience in coal mining and also in agriculture sector.
Let's make that happen. And now over to you, sir, for your question.
Here. Yes, my name is Sal Jafar. I am the founder and CEO of ESGMINA.com, the first and only environment, social, and governance knowledge hub in the Middle East and North Africa. I am also a senior geopolitical analyst in the Middle East, especially in terms of the Middle Eastern and the U.S. affairs. Some might say that by Donald Trump, President Trump, bringing Elon Musk, having this alliance or this relationship, they will be trying to have an alliance for the supply chain of batteries and lithium and basically of the materials, raw materials that would include Chile, Argentina, Australia, and Bolivia, basically to counter the Chinese production. How do you foresee the position of Australia in this regard?
I think we're going to take that question on notice, and there are a lot of experts in this pavilion who you can chat with in 5 minutes' time that might have a better sense of that, because I'm not sure there's the best link to methane in that one. And I do want to take this last opportunity to pass across the panel. What do you see for everyone as the biggest opportunity to accelerate methane action in the next 2 years? Wonder why we're thinking about 2 years, but in the next 2 years, what's the biggest opportunity to accelerate methane action? Now, I went to you but first, Chen Mian. Derek, will you kick us off, and maybe we can go down the line and you can come in for the last thoughts.
Well, building on your excellent comments about China, we've had a lot of corporate commitments. We've had a lot of corporate commitments, buyer agreements, supplier commitments. We just got to implement a lot of these going forward, and I think the tools available with the new satellite technology and others are going to make it that much easier to enforce accountability. The U.S. needs to clearly maintain their oil and gas methane standards. The EU needs to implement theirs. We need to see Canada finalize and implement theirs, and we'd love to see Australia build on their excellent MRV initiatives and create the standards there as well.
Yeah, I think we're at COP, so setting methane targets in the next NDC, setting those sectoral plans, and then let's talk internationally about how we really get into the detail and collaborate across sectors. And I'm really excited for Australia's role within that as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, we know from the literature on social change that there's not one thing. And so it's the interaction of multiple things that's going to make a difference, but they have to be effective. So what's happening at COP here, I have enough advocacy, I think, for OGMP and SMP are absolutely critical to have instruments that connect to the agent who can do the mitigation, because we have to have the full visibility on the chain, or else it's just not going to happen. Satellites are only one part of the solution, policy is one part of the solution, and engagement with industry is another. But we have to have each of those, and they have to be tough and well thought through.
I hope this this next process, of course, we have a whole bunch of countries, as you said, on methane mitigation targets and NDCs. But I do think one of the things that are going to be important this year is going to be the implementation of the methane supply index. Once we start getting the data, be able to really characterize the system and make sure that these regulations stay in place, and the rest of the countries that want to access the European market get something in place. I'd like to look into Japan, continuing with methane import standards. I'd like to see Korea move on this, because the reality is a natural gas transition with high leakage rate is totally questionable. And so if we want that natural gas to be a transition, they have to prove that the emissions are reduced. And at current levels, it is not a good transition. And so the only way to believe it is to have those import standards be implemented. I also would like to see potentially China incorporate this methane targets into their 5-year plan. I think is really important because they've shown a lot of leadership already. And finally, I do think the surprise will be the progress on agricultural methane, because there will be things that you will not see. It only costs $0.01 to reduce 30% of methane emissions per liter of milk. I don't think anybody had that in their mind. They thought these solutions were more expensive. And I do think the landfill emissions opportunity is one that really has been underestimated. The first image that Tanager 1 detected was a landfill, and the major sources in many places that are not oil and gas producers are landfills, which in themselves could account for as much pollution as hundreds of thousands of cars, and so therefore a very sore blister for any city that wants to say they're sustainable.
Some key mitigation opportunities in China. I think one of the most important one is the coal mine methane emission standards. So under these new emission standards, they probably gonna regulate all these coal mine methane that is larger than 5%, which actually can generate some mitigation potentials for China. And another very important mitigation opportunities is at the subnational level, because we're going to see more provinces and even like city levels, they're gonna issue their local methane action plans. So that's just advance the implementation of these local methane action plans. I think that is also going to bring a lot of mitigation potentials. Yeah, thank you.
All right, and Marcelo, I might go back to you. You have a bit of a global role, but I want to ask you a bit of a pointed question. Are you coming after our beef?
No, we actually joke around that it'd be great to have beef come back to COP and the cocktails. We can fix beef. We can reduce those emissions, and it's maybe not for health reasons. We probably should cut down, but I do believe that it's not viable to have a population in which you have income coming from pastoral livelihoods that really could benefit from increased nutrition. So it's a little bit difficult for us that probably should eat less beef to tell others who should eat more to do. So basically, it's not about we don't need zero methane emissions from agriculture. We could keep it, and actually we're developing technologies to reduce those emissions in half, because we do have to do that between 2030 and 2050.
All right, well, if we're going to take this forward, if Australia is going to be a leader on methane going forward for the next 2 years, we might need some help. Can we get you out to Australia to taste some of our beef anytime soon?
I'm going to go out there to go visit and lay the groundwork for a methane COP again, because many of these have been methane COPs. Dubai had a great decision on the context of methane, and I do think that there's a space of leadership that could be taken overall. On coal methane, between China and Australia, it's 73% of all methane emissions. So it's something we could definitely manage, and it's aligned with multiple objectives. Of course, we need to get rid of thermal coal, as Roland was saying, and that's probably dead because of prices. And I contributed to putting a nail in the coffin in Chile with the coal phase-out agreement that we actually have. We're shutting down coal faster than any other developing country. But metallurgical coal is not solved yet, and in those 20 years, we really need to reduce those emissions.
Well, thank you, Marcelo. Thank you, everyone. There is an opportunity for subnational collaboration with China, an opportunity for further collaboration with Global Methane Hub in Australia coming up. I hope you'll all take those opportunities forward. And thank you so much for joining us today. Methane's not everyone's first topic. I hope you learned some things. I hope you're excited. And let's take this forward. Let's make methane one of the key policy asks when Australia takes up hosting of COP31 in 2 years' time. Thank you very much, everyone.